All right, The Womping Willow, Chapter 5. I'm going to read this in two parts, too. The end of summer vacation came far too quickly for Harry's liking. He was looking forward to getting back to Hogwarts, but this month at the Burr had been the happiest of his life. It was difficult not to feel jealous of Ron when he thought of the Dursleys and the sort of welcome he could expect next time he turned up at Privet Drive. On the last evening, Mrs. Weasley conjured up a sumptuous dinner that included all of Harry's favourite things, ending with a mouth-watering treacle pudding. Fred and George rounded off the evening with a display of filibuster fireworks that filled the kitchen with red and blue stars that bounced from ceiling to the wall for at least half an hour. Then it was time for a last mug of hot chocolate in bed. It took a long while to get started the next morning. They were up at dawn, but somehow they still seemed to have a great deal to do. Mrs. Weasley dashed about in a bad mood, looking for spare socks and quills. People kept colliding on the stairs, half dressed with bits of toast in their hands, and Mr. Weasley nearly broke his neck, tripping over a stray chicken that crossed the yard as he was carrying Ginny's trunk. Harry couldn't see how 8 people, 6 large trunks, and 2 owls and a rat were going to fit in that small forward Angela. He had reckoned, of course, without special features that Mr. Weasley had added. "Not a word to Molly," he whispered to Harry as he opened the trunk and showed him how it had been magically expanded, for the luggage fitted easily. When at last they were all in the car, Mrs. Weasley glanced into the back seat, where Harry, Ron, Fred, George, and Percy were all sitting comfortably side by side, and said, "Muggles do know more than we give them credit for, don't they?" she said to Ginny, who got into the front seat, which had been stretched so that it resembled a park bench. "I mean, you'd never know it was this roomy from the outside, would you?" Mr. Weasley started up the engine, and they trundled out of the yard, Harry turning back for one last look at the house. He barely had time to wonder when he was going to see it again, and when they back, George had forgotten his box of filibuster fireworks. 5 minutes after that, they skidded to a halt in the yard so that Fred could run into for his broomstick. They had almost reached the highway when Ginny shrieked that she'd left her diary. By the time they had clambered back into the car and were running very late, tempers were running high. Mr. Weasley glanced at his watch and then at his wife. "Molly, dear." "No, Arthur." "No one would see. This little button here. It's an invisibility booster. I installed it. They'd get up in the air, and then we'd fly over the clouds. We'd be there in 10 minutes, and no one would be any wiser." "I said no, Arthur, not in broad daylight." They reached King's Cross at 11:15. Mr. Weasley dashed across the road to get the trolleys for their trunks, and they all hurried into the station. Harry had caught the Hogwarts Express the previous year. The tricky part was getting on to the platform 9 3/4, which was invisible to the Muggle eye. What you had to do was you had to walk right through a solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. It didn't hurt, but it had to be done carefully, so that none of the Muggles noticed you were vanishing. "Percy first," said Mrs. Weasley, looking nervously at the clock overhead, which showed that they had only 5 minutes to disappear casually through the barrier. Percy strode briskly forward and vanished. "Mr. Weasley next." When Fred and George followed, "I'll take Ginny. You two come right after us," Mrs. Weasley told Harry and Ron, grabbing Ginny's hand and setting off. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. "Let's go together. We've only got a minute," Ron said to Harry. Harry made sure that Hedwig's cage was safely wedged on the top of his trunk. He wheeled his trolley around to face the barrier. He felt perfectly confident this wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as using the Floo powder. Both of them went and lowered their handles of their trolleys and walked purposely towards the barrier, gathering speed. A few feet away from it, and they broke into a run, and crash! Both trolleys hit the barrier and bounced backwards. Ron's trunk fell off with a loud thump. Harry's knocked off his feet, and Hedwig's cage bounced onto the shiny floor, and rolled away, shrieking indignantly. People all around them stared, and a guard nearby yelled, "What in blazes do you think you're doing?" "Lost control of the trolley," Harry gasped, clutching his ribs as he got up. Harry ran to pick up Hedwig, who was causing such a scene that there was a lot of muttering about cruelty to animals from the surrounding crowd. "Why can't we get through?" Harry hissed to Ron. "I don't know." Ron looked wildly about. A dozen curious people were still watching them. "We're going to miss the train," Ron whispered. "I don't understand why the gateway's sealed off." Harry looked at the giant clock, a sickening feeling in a pit in his stomach. 10 seconds, 9 seconds. He wheeled the trolley forward cautiously until it was right against the barrier and pushed with all his might. The metal remained solid. 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. It's gone. Ron sounding stunned. "The train's left. What if Mom and Dad can't get back through to us?" "Have you got any muggle money?" Harry gave a hollow laugh. "The Dursleys haven't given me pocket money for about 6 years. Ron pressed his ear against the loud barrier. "I can't hear anything," he said tensely. "What are we going to do? I don't know how long it'll take Mom and Dad to get back to us." They looked around. People were still watching them, mainly because of the Hedwig's continuing screeches. "I think we better go wait in the car," said Harry. "We're attracting too much attention." "Harry," said Ron's eyes gleaming, "the car! What about it? We can fly to the car to Hogwarts, but I thought we're stuck, right? We've got to get to school, haven't we? And we're underage wizards are allowed to use magic if it's a real emergency. Section 19 or something of the restrictions thingy." "But your mom and dad," said Harry, pushing against the barrier, against the vein, hoping it would give way. "How will they ever get home? They don't need a car," Rod said impatiently. "They know how to operate. You know, just vanish and then reappear at home. They only bother with the flu powder and the car because we're still underage, and they're not allowed to operate. We're not allowed to operate yet." Harry's feeling of panic turned suddenly into excitement. "Can you fly it?" "No problem," said Ron, wheeling his trolley around to face the next exit. "Come on, let's get off. If we hurry, we'll be able to follow the Hogwarts Express." And they marched off through the crowd to the curious muggles, out of the station and back into the side road where the old Ford Angela was parked. Ron unlocked the cavernous trunk into a series of taps from his wand, and then heaved their luggage back in. But Hedwig, in the back seat, and got into the front. "Check that there's no one watching," said Ron, starting the ignition. With another tap of his wand, Harry stuck his head out of the window. Traffic was rumbling along the main road, but the street was empty. "Okay," he said. Ron pressed a tiny silver button on the dashboard. The car around him vanished, and so did they. Harry could feel the vibrating beneath him, hear the engine, feel his hands and his knees, and his glasses on his nose, but for all he could see, he'd become a pair of eyeballs floating a few feet above the ground in a dingy street full of parked cars. "Let's go," said Ron's voice from the right. And the ground and the dirty buildings either side fell away. Dropping out of sight, there was a car that rose in seconds. The whole lot of London lay smoky and glittering below them. Then there were popping noises in the car. Harry knew Ron reappeared. "Uh-oh," said Ron, jabbing the invisibility booster. "It's a faulty." Both of them plummeted. The car vanished, and it flickered back again. "Hold on," said Ron yelled, and he slammed his foot on the accelerator. And they shot straight into the low, rolly clouds. Everything turned dull and foggy. "Now what?" said Harry, blinking at the solid mass of clouds pressing in on them and from all sides. "We need to see if the train to know the direction we're to go in," said Ron. "Dip back down again quickly." They dropped back beneath the clouds, twisted around to see the cars, so squinting to the ground. Can't see it! Harry yelled. Right there, ahead, there! The Hogwarts Express was streaking along below them like a scarlet snake. Due north, said Ron, checking the compass on the dashboard. Okay, we'll have to check on it every half an hour or so. Hold on. Then they shot up through the clouds. A minute later, they burst into a blaze of sunlight. It was a different world. The wheels of the car skimmed the sea of the fluffy clouds and the sky of a bright, endless blue under the blinding white sun. All we've got to worry about now is airplanes, said Ron. They looked at each other and started to laugh. For a long time they couldn't stop. The thought that they had plunged into the fabulous dream that like this, thought Harry, was surely the only way to travel. Past swirls, turrets, snowy clouds, cars full of hot, bright sunlight, with fat-packed toffees in the glove compartment, and prospect of seeing Fred and George's jealous faces when they landed smoothly and spectacularly on the sweeping lawn of the front yard of Hogwarts Castle. They made regular checks on the train and flew farther and farther north, each dip beneath the clouds showing them a different view. London was soon far behind them, and replaced by the neat green fields that gave away to turn to wide purplish moors, a great city alive with cars and multicolored ants, villages with tiny toy churches. Several uneventful hours later, however, Harry had to admit that some of the fun was wearing off. The toffees had made them extremely thirsty, and they had nothing to drink. He and Ron had pulled off their sweaters, but Harry's t-shirt was sticking to the back of the seat, and his glasses kept sliding down at the end of his sweaty nose. He had stopped noticing the fantastic cloud shapes now, and was thinking longingly of the train miles below, where they could buy icy cold pumpkin juice from the trolley pushed by the plump witch. Why hadn't they been able to get through the platform 9 3/4? Can't be much further, can it? Ron croaked. Hours later, the sun started to sink into on the floor of the cloud, straining in a deep pink. Ready for another check of the train? It was still right below them, winding its way to the snow-capped mountain. It was much darker beneath the canopy of clouds. Ron put his foot on the accelerator and drove them upward again, and then, as he did so, the engine began to whine. Harry and Ron exchanged nervous glances. Probably just tired, said Ron. It's never flown this far before. And they both pretended not to notice the whining growing louder and louder, and the sky becoming steadily darker, and the stars were blossoming in the blackness. Harry pulled the sweater back on, trying to ignore the way the windshield wipers were now waving feebly, as though they were in protest. Not far, said Ron, more to the car than to Harry. Not far now. He patted the dashboard nervously. When they flew back beneath the clouds a little while later, they had to squint through the darkness of the landmark, and they knew. There! Harry shouted, making Ron and Hedwig jump. Straight ahead, silhouetted in the dark horizon, high in the cliff over the lake, stood the many turrets and the towers of Hogwarts Castle. But the car had begun to shudder and was losing speed. Come on, Rod said cajolingly, giving its steering wheel a little shake. Nearly there, come on. The engine groaned. Narrow jets of steam were issuing from under the hood. Harry found himself gripping the edges of the seat very hard as they flew towards the lake. The car gave a nasty wobble. Glancing out of the wind, Harry saw the smooth, black, glassy surface of the water a mile below. Ron's knuckles were white in the steering wheel, and the car wobbled again. Come on, Ron muttered. They were over the lake. The castle was right ahead. Ron put his foot down. There was a loud clunk, sputter, and the engine died completely.